That is Josh Husher on Radio 3 with Imperfections. Good afternoon. Last bit of today's programme. Absolute pleasure to welcome to the programme all the way from Scotland, Dr. Howard Dryden. Now, he's the founder of a thing called the GOES Foundation, the Global Oceanic Environmental Survey Foundation. Basically, between you and me, it's about water. Howard, good to see you. Welcome along. Your timing couldn't have been better, because I'm sure you're up to speed on all the sort of local news about water quality, but I have a feeling it was quite a coincidence that you're here at this time.
Well, it's not exactly a coincidence. There's always a water issue anywhere we go in the world.
Yeah.
It so happens there is a particular issue currently in Hong Kong.
A highlighted one, if you like, which we've not seen here before, even though it's probably been going on for ages.
Well, there's always water issues with regards to industrial and domestic pollution. But what I really want to focus on today is the impact that pollution from industry and domestic sources has on the marine ecosystem.
Right, back to square one, really.
It is, and I think we forget that 50 to 90% of all our oxygen and carbon dioxide is actually, the oxygen produced by the ocean, 80% to 90%. And up to 90% of all the carbon dioxide is fixed by the seas.
Okay. Well, so basically what we've been hearing about the news here is the chain going upwards towards us. But I suppose you're talking about going the other way.
Absolutely.
Like. Yeah. What sort of things have you noticed in your studies about this part of the world, or are we just the same as everywhere else?
Well, I think when we're dealing with the oceans, the oceans connect every country in the world.
Yeah.
And pollution connects every country in the world. And, we're hearing more and more about climate change and the impact that carbon dioxide has on the ecosystem. And it may well be that we don't have the correct solution to this. And this is where the GOES Foundation comes on board.
Tell us a bit more about how you guys go about things.
For sure. Well, if 90% of all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is sequestered by the oceans, then the oceans play a really important role in controlling the climate, the global climate. Now, the oceans control the CO2 by a process called primary productivity.
Right.
Primary productivity is the growth of the plants, the small zooplankton animals. And what we now know is that over the last 50 years, since the industrial or the chemical revolution, we have actually lost 40% of the ability of the oceans to absorb carbon dioxide. So in that respect, if we look at the anthropogenic production of CO2 from the burning of fossil fuels and the combustion of petrol and diesel, that only accounts for 3% of all the CO2 going into the atmosphere. But 90% is being absorbed by the oceans. And if we have lost 40% of the ability of the oceans to absorb the CO2, then perhaps the oceans and the reduction in productivity is the primary mechanism for climate change.
There's something that always fascinates me, that when people want to progress in one way, when we want to progress technologically or in some other way, there's always a cost. And I think the cost angle is what you're talking about. But the question for me is, how much of it is just unavoidable?
Well, actually, the cost is much greater by not doing anything. Currently, with the reduction in productivity of the oceans, as a consequence that the CO2 is building up in the sea. And CO2 is acidic. And as the carbon dioxide builds up in the oceans, the pH of the oceans decline. This is called ocean acidification. And currently, the ocean pH, getting too technical now, but ocean pH is 8.06. It was 8.2 50 years ago. Now, if we follow the projections of the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Committee on Climate Change, they predict that CO2 levels will double over the next 50 years. If that happens, then the pH of the oceans will drop to pH 7.9. So it's only a small drop from 8.06 to 7.9. But most of the organisms in the oceans are based on carbonate. Carbonate dissolves when you become acidic. So what we could be looking at here is called a trophic cascade destabilization of the entire marine ecosystem, which means that we lose the ability of the oceans to absorb CO2. And if you lose that primary productivity, then the food source of all the fish is gone. So worst case scenario is over the next 25 to 50 years, we could lose all the fish.
I was going to ask you about the time frame. I didn't expect you to say 25 to 50 years.
Yeah.
Goodness me, I'd put a couple more zeros on there. Let's look back on these past 50 years you just mentioned. people love to be able to digest things. We need to be, the empiric reasons. Are there one or two things that really seriously contributed to this change in the past 50 years?
For sure. It's since what I refer to as the chemical revolution. From the 1950s, that's when we started producing herbicides, pesticides, chemicals called PCBs, fire retardants, PBDE. Now, these are all man-made chemicals, and the ecosystem has not evolved or adapted to be able to metabolize these chemicals. As a consequence, they're building up in the ecosystem, and they're impacting on the ability of the plants and the animals in the oceans to really to grow and to metabolize and to reproduce. And because of that, the productivity of the oceans has dropped by up to 40%. And indeed, more recently, NASA have been using new imagery from satellites, and they have calculated that the productivity of the oceans are dropping by 1% every year.
One word that stood out there was pesticides. So people have been growing things to survive since the word go. Now, the advent of pesticides wasn't that long ago. What was the need? What was the habit that changed in us to require these things? Was it just we want more of it and we want it to look all the same?
Well, if you the pesticides do have an important role to play, especially with food production. Without pesticides, then there would be bigger issues involved. But it doesn't mean to say that there isn't scope for development of new chemicals which are not so toxic to the ecosystem.
And I'm assuming that hasn't happened because certain big chemical companies, other big chemical, don't want it to happen.
Well, partly that. It's also, I think, a question of awareness.
Right.
If you don't monitor something, then you don't have the information upon which you can make a valid judgment. So, this is what the Goals Foundation is about: is to really raise the awareness of the issues, and also to create new industry to solve these problems. But you'll never solve the problems unless you're actually aware that a problem exists in the first place.
I don't know if we've ever had like an eco-friendly company that we could call disruptive. They're just squished out usually, aren't they?
Well, no, there's eco-friendly companies doing very well, within Europe. And as the public become more aware of the issues and they have their health and well-being, not only of the environment but of themselves as well, then these companies are developing. So I think there's potentially a good future, but we have to make it more aware to the public.
So what usually happens when you talk to the public? Do they say, we're aware of this, but we just don't know what to do?
Yeah, and the same thing happens to governments. I think with regards to climate change and the anthropogenic of CO2, it's such a huge engine that's driving in one direction. And to change the direction of that momentum is very difficult.
Yeah, I'm thinking the government say, we're aware of this, but we better put it out to tender.
That can happen.
Come on, you know what I'm talking about. How much does that kind of stuff get in the way? Bureaucracy?
Well, bureaucracy always gets in the way, but I think it's the responsibility of everyone to put pressure, not only on government, but also on industry. But, if you look at the impact of these chemicals on the environment, from the developed world and, Europe and North America, the primary chemicals come from domestic applications. It's the detergents that are being used, the dishwashing chemicals, clothes chemicals, antiseptics. It's all these chemicals are having an impact.
Why would these chemicals be the ones? Is it because the advertising guys and the companies are saying, we will make this whiter, we will make this X, Y, and Z, and the only way to do it is with these specific extra chemicals?
That's exactly the situation. And these chemicals are not natural chemicals, they are synthetic. And very, very small amounts of them have a huge impact on the development of biology. So,
And all of the stuff you're talking about somehow goes into water, which takes us back to where we started, this whole chain.
Absolutely. And again, everything that's discharged into the atmosphere or discharged into a river eventually ends up in the oceans. And the oceans connect everyone.
Yeah, I think a real human failing, which we all have sometimes, is the out of sight, out of mind thing. It's only when you start talking about landfills and the such, there are massive ones here in Hong Kong. Blimey, that's where all my rubbish does go, and it doesn't disappear, it doesn't biodegrade.
Well, currently they are what's called the Pacific garbage heaps. They are two massive circulating areas of refuse in the Pacific, the size of Texas. The amount of refuse now in the water is equivalent to 6 times the entire biomass of animals living in the oceans. this refuse floats just below the surface, so it is out of sight.
The invention of plastics is an interesting one. If it hadn't happened, we'd still be probably hundreds of years away behind. But it had to happen for other reasons. So, where do you keep these balls in the air?
Well, if we look at plastics as one example, every living organism in the oceans, from the smallest phytoplankton on the surface to the abyss, contains plastic. Now, there is new developments taking place with plastic, which render them biodegradable. Currently, polyethylene or PVC, they can take hundreds of years to break down. So again, new technology has to come into play to develop materials and products from components that are biodegradable.
On paper, would that work? I've been so interested talking to people such as yourself, and the plastic will go down to it's got a finite size, it won't get smaller, it won't go away. People talk about these mini, the tiniest particle of a plastic, that's it won't go any further.
Of course, well, you're dealing then with the microplastics, and the microplastics are consumed by fish, and that's one of the mechanisms by which the plastics get into the bodies of these animals. But there are companies now producing plastics that will biodegrade. Plastic bags, for example, now in Europe.
And are they tough? I mean, I've seen these things before when you can put your finger through them. I'm sure they've developed them since then.
Well, the early days of the plastic bags perhaps weren't as good as they could be, but again, they're improving.
Yeah. Well, this would be great to see, because it seems that it would fix an amazing amount of the world's problems.
Well, there are huge problems to fix. And so that's what GOES is about, to try and just increase and raise the awareness of these issues.
How do you actually do that?
It's difficult. I've had meetings with Al Gore on the subject.
Well, he's pretty much on side, though, surely, isn't he?
He is, but he's more focused on the burning of fossil fuels. And personally, I don't think that fossil fuels are the primary mechanism. Right. They are part of the problem. But solving issues with the ecosystems, it's never just one problem. It's always a combination of factors that come together.